Good afternoon, everybody here in the Southern Hemisphere, and good morning to those of you joining us from afar. My name is Patricia Hayes. I'm chairing today's session. I am a member of the Center for Humanities Research and the Saatchi Chair in Visual History and Theory. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our second session of 2020 Winter School. Our theme this year is called Exodus, Movement of the/a People. Today is our second meeting of the annual Winter School. And just to explain to those of you who could not join us for the first, we started this year's Winter School a couple of weeks ago with our colleague from the University of Toronto, Ronaldo Walcott, who spoke on the Black Aquatic. And it really was a most lyrical and poetic introduction to our annual deliberations together. Just to mention that the Winter School, which we hold annually, is a partnership between the CHR flagship, which is supported by the Department of Science and Innovation and the National Research Foundation of South Africa. Its other member in South Africa is the Saatchi Chair in Social Change at the University of Fort Hare. Our partners at the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change at the University of Minnesota, the Twin Cities, from where our speaker today is joining us. That's Nancy Luxon. And of course, the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto. So I'd like to welcome you all to today's session, which we're really looking forward to. It's centered on Nancy Luxon's current research work, which she brings to us today under the title Politics and Policing, Spies, Surveillance, and Colonial Subjects in Anti-Colonial French Politics. So if I may, I'd just like to introduce our speaker for today, whose paper has been pre-circulated. And also, I just want to say a little bit about our two wonderful discussants who will be talking to Nancy's presentation and paper as well. So very quickly, let me just introduce Nancy. Nancy is an associate professor of political science at the University of Minnesota, and her work in contemporary political and social theory concentrates on questions of power, subjectivity, and truth-telling. Her first book, Crisis Authority, published in 2013, considers political authority as a political and psychological process in which individuals come to author themselves, and so to act within and against relations of hierarchy. And I think some of those will be detectable in what Nancy's going to talk about today. Now, more recently, she's edited a translation of a really wonderful book called, in English, Disorderly Families, which is a collaboration between historian Arlette Farge and Michel Foucault. And this appeared in English in 2017, along with a really wonderful scholarly companion volume called Archives of Infamy, which I have to say I've been reading recently and enjoying tremendously. Now, Nancy's second monograph is called Staging the Political, Colonial Encounters in North Africa and France, and it analyzes a range of speech contexts from psychiatric clinics at Blida and Charles-Nicolle, going on to journals Tropiques and Présence Africaine, and the sites of anti-colonial post-war politics. So we are in for a wonderful discussion today around this research. Now, let me just briefly introduce our two discussants today who kindly agreed to offer their thoughts in response to Nancy's paper. Our first is Fernanda Almeida, Fernanda is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Humanities Research. Her doctoral research examined the relationship between cinemas, changing imaginaries of race and urban experience in 20th century Cape Town. Fernanda's interests, as many of us know, are much wider. They lie across aesthetics, critical theory, urban politics, and publics, especially in South Africa and Brazil. And our second discussant for today is Lindokuhle Mandioli, who is a PhD fellow at the Center for Humanities Research. Among his interests are political theory and the relationship between power and ideology in the post-colonial South African state. In particular, Lindokuhle has a rich history in student activism, and he's also interested in the intellectual histories in the South African student movement more broadly. So we're delighted to welcome these two very special discussants today. I don't want to hold us up any further. I know we all want to plunge straight into Nancy's presentation. Before we start, may I just ask everybody to kindly, you're very welcome to start formulating your questions as the speakers are talking, and we will accumulate and then try to work our way through them after the presentations. But would you please use the Q&A function on your webinar screen to pose your questions rather than the chat function. Okay, so now it's my pleasure to hand over to Professor Nancy Luxon.
Thank you, Patricia, for that very lovely introduction. Before beginning, I also want to thank Heidi and Michel for finding the enthusiastic good spirits to continue organizing winter school when so many of us find our energies flagging in these pandemic times. The adaptation of the winter school program is just simply brilliant. And as part of that, I wanted to give a special thank you also to Ali for his work with graphic design and making sure that the technology is in place to ensure that these events materialize in this rather ethereal virtual space. And finally, thank you in advance to Fernanda and Lindokuhle for what I am sure will be astute comments. I've been busy imagining and speculating about your queries for the past week, and so now I am eager to hear them in actuality. In short, I am honored and happy to be here, wherever here may be. My only disappointment is that I wish my paper were a bit further along. I found myself returning quite hastily from my archival work in France in March due to the imposition of COVID travel bans. And so much of this research, continues to be in progress, so to speak. By way of launching this conversation, let me highlight some of the central claims of my argument. The paper opens by presenting a striking incident contained within the French colonial archives that themselves are located in Aix-en-Provence. These archives maintain quite literally meters upon meters of police dossiers from the 1920s and 30s, dossiers that report on a variety of worker associations, anti-colonial groups, newspapers, and literary salons in interwar Paris. One of the most valuable dossiers contains pages of reports from an agent Joé, a police informant originally from Madagascar, who was recruited to the police after his war service and subsequent naturalization around 1922 or 1924. Agent Joé, as part of the League for the Defense of the Nègre Race, or the LDRN, was headed to the 1931 Colonial Exposition in Paris to make contact with other colonial subjects who were there as performers. As he emerges from the metro station, he is arrested by two police inspectors and detained at a local police station. He reports on this detention in his surveillance report for the day. When he is detained for a second time, only a few weeks later, by the same police officer, his response is more angry. He speaks out at the idiocy of the French police for seeing him as a threat and arresting one of their own. Peppered throughout his reports, over 12 years of informing on anti-colonial activities, are similar reports and complaints about police harassment. Interestingly, these complaints are often excised from the typed copies of his handwritten reports, copies that circulate much more widely across police precincts and even internationally as far as Hanoi, Dakar, or Brazzaville. Historians have recently identified him as Thomas Ramanjato, but he finds himself to be followed and detained on a number of occasions as the police monitor the activities of the LDRN and other anti-colonial groups. He isn't the only police informant. At one point, the Union of Black Workers, or the UTN, is infiltrated by at least 3 informants, 2 of whom come to hold leadership positions in the organization. And the UTN itself finds itself to be financially supported by the French government when its own financial resources run dry. So where does this incident take us? In my paper, I call attention to 3 questions. First, how do the crisscrossing circulations of police, the itineraries of daily lives lived by Black militants, and the surveillance reports produced by informants slowly give rise to something like a movement or a counterpublic? And I use these terms quite gingerly. Second, how does this flood of primarily worker-oriented political activity and the proliferation of texts complicate existing accounts of Black internationalism or a negritude movement that usually is associated with a cultural elite? Third, what is the work of racialization that is accomplished through policing, and how does it complicate the debates over the politics of whether colonial subjects should identify themselves as noir or as negre? So let me speak very briefly to these 3 questions, just to recap, some of the points and investments that come out in the course of the paper that was circulated. On the first question, this police surveillance, along with Agent Joy's reports and those from other informants, complicate how we might think of alternately an anti-colonial movement of the people, or even an anti-colonial counter-public. These 2 terms of movement or counter-public press in very different ways. A movement suggests something akin to a loose coalition of those looking to advance a set of political and perhaps moral ends, and one that resists some amount of institutional permanence, even as it may rely on institutional organization or hierarchies. The qualifier movement of the or a people quickly underscores the challenge of such a category. It suggests that the people can be unproblematically known and that the people are relatively undifferentiated. By contrast, publics and counterpublics are often, and in a historically inaccurate way, understood in terms of their emergence alongside a nation state and in opposition to state power. In the classic Habermasian formulation, they're identified with a Western print culture and emergent middle class, which circulates images and ideas among a group of readers who do not yet recognize themselves as a collective. The focus here in this paper on police surveillance in the anti-colonial politics of 1920s France thus underscores that movements and counterpublics can neither be understood as distinct from the state, nor from existing political order, more broadly speaking. And so in that sense, they really are complicating the ways that we often use the terms of movements, and counterpublics. Rather than establishing distinct spaces or collectives, these circulations define what I call a field of exchange that changes what kind of political order can be seen or advanced or contested. Second, this focus also emphasizes that the place for the infiltration and shaping power of political authority via the intermediaries of the police is paramount. These itineraries of police, of informants, and of anti-colonial militants show up the simplistic nature of usual juxtapositions of state and society, or movements versus political power. Such conceptual confusion poses a problem not just for thinking about anti-colonial politics and categories, but it should also remind that policing has always operated in the service of racial politics and often lies at the heart of struggles over power and over the people's access to power. When the French police expanded their jurisdiction and prerogative in the mid-18th century, for example, they did so in response to demands from everyday people to rethink and broaden the scope for justice so as to include more quotidian demands, and well before any kind of public or public opinion came into existence. Publics and policing emerged in tandem with each other, along with the effort to rethink state politics and power on new terms. And with these anti-colonial counter-publics or movements, we see very much a similar set of dynamics, but oriented towards two different sets of political ideologies, two different visions of political order. Brought back to anti-colonial politics then, this police surveillance and the racialization of police informants redirects attention away from a stylized juxtaposition of colonizer and colonized. Instead, we might think about these informants as what Foucault has called exchangers. By exchangers, Foucault designates those social intermediaries who knit together, but also trespass between two disparate political contexts that are governed by different political logics, and as well as by fields of exchange that are susceptible to organization according to these two different logics. These exchangers, be they sites or agents of power, come to extend power in multiple ways. First and most obviously, they mediate between power above and power below. That is, they channel and regulate the extension of colonial power into militant activities. This shaping power is multivalent. The detailed daily reports offered by informants provide us with the chance to eavesdrop on quotidian conversations that otherwise are beyond the reach of police and certainly us academics. Yet these reports also cannot be taken at face value. The informant's own motivations are unreliable, and while anti-colonialists knew about the use of informants and took preventative steps to protect themselves and their organization, they often didn't know exactly who was reporting on what back to the police. Second, these exchangers often trespass into ambiguous sites. So informants moved between tight-knit Vietnamese restaurant workers, the dockyards of Marseille populated by colonial stowaways, and a welter of community meetings held across interwar Paris, that moved around quite a bit and often were held at odd hours. Third, these exchangers knit together disparate parts of the social fabric by connecting different sites, classes, and social experiences. Across all of these experiences, the exchangers play a polyvalent role in mediating power and social representation. They thus come to serve as relays of power, and especially they help to negotiate the contradiction between French republicanism, an ideology premised on liberty and equality of all citizens, and a French imperialism premised on the exclusion of colonial subjects from citizenship, and so the continuation of relationships of dependency. Both as exchangers and as bad subjects in their own ways, police informants inadvertently draw together disparate groups and activate power in an emergent social and political context. As we'll see in the next section, this para-institutional role will come to shape the direction and the intensity of the terms of the nascent Black internationalism. So that brings me then to my second point. This incident report from Agent Jouet, along with the surveillance that he conducted over 12 years, also challenges conventional ways of considering Black internationalism. Although movement in this context is most readily associated with the negritude movement of the 1930s and 40s, one whose recognition coincides with increased recognition of claims to national self-determination, and brings us to the work of Aimé Césaire, Léopold Senghor, Léon Damas, with their roots in various literary circles. It in fact this negritude movement in fact has its roots in an earlier set of literary and political circuits from the 1920s and 30s that Césaire, Senghor, and Damas were very much a part of. These literary circuits had a parallel in the workers' associations that likewise organized community meetings, newspapers, and instructional sessions alongside their more explicitly political activities. So across these two different movements then, emerges a dispute over the terms to define anti-colonial experience in the wake of the friction that I just described between France's Republican and imperialist ideologies. Although some of the fissures around class and ethnicity come to fracture both movements, those around the Nardal sisters, who are more oriented towards a literary scene, incline towards developing a race-conscious cultural movement, while those newspapers and organizations that are associated with the LDRN and its successors tend, towards a more material language, even as they also are wrestling with, what are and ought to be the terms of group affiliation. So somewhat similar to the police informants, these literary and political contributors from both movements also are working in a colonial in-between space. That is, debates over the terms of noir and nègre are less semantic debates than debates over the organizing logics of an emergent Black internationalism, but in a space that is not yet defined or settled on the terms of a singular vision of political order. At this juncture in the paper, I consider movement then in a different sense, as the organization and dissemination of ideas and representations of Black French colonial subjects. So here the movement that was associated with the Nardal sisters, with René Marchand, and later with Césaire and Senghor, considers identities defined as noir or nègre and the different race-conscious politics that ensue. The politics here range from colonial reformism to assimilationalism to a politics of liberation. The anti-colonial movements associated with the LDRN, the CDRN, or the UTN likewise get caught up in debates about what they call or name as the Antilles question, and how to balance these debates against the group's avowed anti-colonial commitments. And so again, there's this question about how to understand the terms of affiliation, of representation, and politics. In both cases, debates were pushed onto racialized terms by the response of French authorities determined to censor anti-colonial journals and newspapers, to raid workers' associations, and to spy on both, regardless the politics of either movement. And so once again, we find that spies here have a very ambivalent role in both sets of movements. The distinction between different kinds of organizing hierarchy and racial markers possibly sheds light on the role played by spies within these anti-colonial associations. Perhaps police informants like Agent Jouet could be simultaneously spies and spokesmen because they understood these roles to be attached to different political orders and logics. They were spies in the name of a French Republic that, for all intents and purposes, was an illusion, while also being spokesmen for an anti-colonial order yet to come. To the extent that the two orders remained inscrutable to one another, these spies could live cloaked by others, and possibly their own, colonial aphasia. Agent Jouet's arrest exemplifies this contradiction and the impossibility of really keeping Republican and imperial orders distinct. Given his veteran status, his citizenship, his French wife, as well as his spying activities, Agent Jouet should have been above reproach. And yet even the police who employed him could only see him as another indigène. Beyond the contradiction of his personal circumstances, Agent Jouet was caught in the determination of French authorities to ignore the contradictions of imperial nation state and to racialize those who revealed the limits of its Republican ideology. So then this brings me to my third and final point. These tensions between the two different movements and the contradictions between two different governing logics, that of republicanism and that of imperialism, come to the head in the staging of the exposition itself. At this point in the paper, I point to a third kind of movement, the movement of spectators, police, performers, and informants through the colonial exposition itself. The exposition becomes very interesting, not just for the garish and caricatural display of colonial subjects, but because of the different forms and expressions of agency that it permits. The performers are expected to contribute to relatively static and exoticized tableaus and are not permitted to leave the grounds of the exposition or to circulate through Paris, except under very tightly regulated conditions. Their agency is severely limited and defined by their structural position as colonial subjects, while also being anchored in colonial representation. White French spectators, by contrast, are invited to take a trip around the world in a day and to experience, viscerally, France's colonial holdings by visiting the different pavilions and taking in spectacles. In a more complicated fashion, however, they are also invited to break the imperial frame. That is, to take an elevator, for example, to the top of the reproduction of the Genet Mosque and to take in the panorama of the Parisian skyline. Other aspects of the exposition likewise invite them to participate in this now you see it, now you don't quality of acknowledging France as a republic founded on the rights of man, while also experiencing its imperial domination. Spectators are invited to see and to not see, and to be minimally in control of that play of representations. And so that's a second way of thinking about this agency of circulation. The police and informants exercise a much more ambivalent agency. They are the ones who move about behind the scenes and understand the staging of the exposition as contributing to both Republican and imperial ideologies. And so in that sense, they exercise an agency in which they both trespass and enter spheres where they shouldn't be, while also connecting or bringing together unexpected networks. Agent Jouet, for example, is both Black and out of place when he arrives at the exposition. Once his informant status is sorted out, however, he returns several times and makes connections to performers on site. And interestingly enough, he returns to tail other anti-colonial militants as they move about the exposition, trying, to reach out to and make contact with other colonial subjects. More so even than the police, these agents had some awareness of the connections, albeit weak, between Africans and Antilleans, but also between these groups and Vietnamese and Chinese communities in Paris. So this third way of conceiving of agency emphasizes those switch points of power that bind together different sites and different interpretive grids, as well as movement along these different junctures. So for me then, the interest of this project really lies in its ability to think through and separate these different forms of agency, and then to use them as a way to approach the dynamics of racialization and anti-colonialism at play in these different movements. And on that point, I will end and turn things over to the discussants.
May I invite Fernanda to speak to us now? Thank you, Fernanda. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Patricia. Also, thank you to Arlette and Michel for organizing this session. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. It is a great privilege to discuss Professor Luxon's paper. I really enjoyed reading the paper. I found the subject timely and especially relevant to our theme this year. I thought the attention to the different layers of analysis of police, the focus on circulation of individuals, of groups, artifacts, and discourses offered exciting conceptual possibilities. I particularly appreciated the focus on sites of exchange, whose descriptions adds to our understanding of anti-colonial movements, as much as the tactics and techniques employed in their suppression. Luxon's paper presents the possibility of theorizing from an in-depth consideration of police work in 20th century Paris. She focuses on those targeted as, quote, circulating colonial subjects, regardless of citizenship status, and the imagined threat represented by various anti-colonial movements in the French metropole. Luxon focuses on the period of the 1920s and 30s and around the colonial exposition, a multi-layered visual spectacle that showcased the dream of French imperial domination. Luxon follows the paper trail of police reports, tracing their forms of circulation, beginning with the arrest of a police informant. She reconstructs the story of informant's testimony to analyze police information circuits and surveillance artifacts. Colonial informants, Luxon suggests, are exchangers, a term inspired by Foucault that she used to describe how informants connect otherwise diffuse locations and individuals and form what she calls ambiguous sites. The colonial exposition is a pivotal site of exchange that also obscures the fault lines between French imperialism and French Republican aspirations. The exposition also presents colonial subjects as part of a telos of conquest and assimilation, eliding any markers of political contradiction and effacing the possibilities of colonial subjects becoming unmarked French citizens, as famously described by Frantz Fanon in the immediate post-war period. From the beginning of the paper, we are invited to enter the French metropole precisely through the exposition's recreation of colonial scenes, its visual flattening of diverse periods and sites under French control, creating a place Foucault called in the lecture on different spaces, a heterotopia. Heterotopias are opposed to utopias, those imaginary locations that have liminal or no spatial reference. Heterotopias, on the other hand, presuppose not only real sites of reference, but they hinge on concrete material relations that Foucault broadly called emplacements. On entering the colonial exposition, we are emplaced in this aesthetic background of the juxtaposed images of places and peoples under French tutelage. Using the notion of circulation, Luxon sets these life-size dioramas in motion and reveals the decay of fantasies of imperial conquest and sea voyage as a reservoir of political imagination. This again evokes Foucault, where in the same text, he speaks of the decline of colonial heterotopia as, quote, without ships, the dreams dry up, espionage takes the place of adventure, and the police that of corsairs, end quote. From the vantage point of the colonial citizen turned informant, as much as for individuals exposed as colonial artifacts, the Parisian exposition offered less an emplacement than an entrapment. At various points of this paper, Luxon reveals this entrapments by mapping the informant's trajectories of circulation and exchange. Luxon's mapping, not unlike the technology of surveillance she recovers, presents its own limitations. So, for example, how to frame the informants on political commitments. The paper portrays the fragmented landscape these police reports struggle to represent and can be thought at a meta level as an inquiry on the political nature of testimony and the evidence that it produces. Police informants appear thus as agents disseminating data and knowledge which provides the police with a sense, or a kind of limited cartography at least, of dynamic anti-colonial movements. Surveillance technologies, Luxon argues, didn't prevent the formation of such groups or curtail them. Instead, they helped to shape the exchanges integral to their formation. Ordering these disparate reports and artifacts, Luxon demonstrates that the landscape of reports is also part of the simulacrum that the colonial exposition expresses. In other words, by reading the informant's reports, we are also reading about the metabolic circuits of colonial formation and information and how they respond to the contradiction between empire and republic. That is why, in Luxon's analysis, informants become, quote, relays of power, both by calibrating the movement's anti-colonial character and by mediating the institutional responses to them as either imperial or national threat. I'd like us to pause here and return to the promising points of departure the paper offers. In the first pages, Luxon anticipates the connection between her account and the contested politics of race and class of this movement. This contested terrain pertains to the political contradiction revealed in the prioritizing of political solidarity around racial categories such as noir and nègre. Although Luxon argues that these terms do not appear unmediated, but are instead produced directly or indirectly to surveillance, it is less clear how these racial distinctions appear or are silenced by the informants and the reports themselves. Following this, how are the circuits regulated by police control also connected to the administration of racial difference in the colonies? I'm thinking here of the notions of the so-called assimilated noir or unassimilable nègre. The very definition of the criminal is entangled in the notion of assimilation, oscillating between a universalist desire for assimilation and the imputation of lack of assimilation as criminal. In this sense, a more detailed description of the political work of police could reveal the uneven intersections of republicanism and racial assimilation, related, for example, to notions of passing and of métissage. Again, the paper gives us some idea of how these debates unfold in Paris, but how do they circuit back to the colonies? At this point, I'm reminded of the journal Légitime Défense, launched by a group of Martinican students in 1932 in Paris, and almost immediately suppressed by police. Animating the journal's launch, oh, sorry. Oh, I lost my point here. So, animating the journal's launch was a declaration of the author's, quote, emerging from the French mulatto bourgeoisie, one of the most depressing things on earth, as well as, quote, the most enthusiastic traders of this class, end quote. Whereas the paper points to the political decoupling of the literary class and the working class in the metropole, I wonder how a language of infiltrators and traders, and perhaps the mistranslation of these categories, travel from and to the colonies. What perhaps remains unexplored here is the implication of complicity that already circulates in such discourses. I believe the work of Ghanaian poet Léon Damas in the celebrated volume of Poetry Pigments is an interesting addition to this discussion, particularly his poem Hiccups, with the mass memories of his mother's desire for, quote, a noteworthy son. The poet remembers his mother's warnings that are connected to particular class markers, with skin pigmentation determining one's position in the colonial hierarchy of labor and privilege. The poem ends with his mother prohibiting him from playing the banjo as, quote, mulattoes do not do that, leave it to the nègre, end quote. The poem suggests that colonial anxiety around complicity makes recurrent appearances in the form of uncontained bodily assaults, hiccups, quote, and in vain I swallow 7 gulps of water 3 to 4 times a day. My childhood returns to me in a shaking hiccup, my instinct like the cop, the thug. These categories, noir, nègre, mulatto, reveal distinct circuits of embodiment and consciousness of race that, as the paper suggests, become critical to the ideological disputes within anti-colonial movements. This is particularly relevant if we agree with the premise on page 17 that the very concept of colonial domination, and perhaps by implication freedom, hinges on the terms of such disputes. And yet, tensions around the entanglement of race and class are not particular to metropolitan anti-colonial imagination and map onto similar tensions in liberation movements elsewhere. Focusing on this premise, I'd like to open up to 3 sets of questions. My first question is, what is the relationship between the criminal and the political? And what is the role of the police in redefining the limits of a so-called politics of assimilation? In other words, what work were police reports imagined to do for controlling citizenship, and how were they instrumental in legitimizing intelligence work and spycraft? An associated question is, what is the relationship between forensics and surveillance? I'm thinking here of the forensic tool like graphology, a discredited method created in France that was used both by the police and the military to detect forgery. Incidentally, it was the use of graphology and the accusation of forgery that captured the French imagination around the figure of the spy in the infamous Dreyfus affair. This was a pivotal case that weaponized espionage, and it worked as a way into mobilizing public affect with profound resonance with xenophobic and anti-Semitic politics in Europe. The second question is about the circulation of regimes of surveillance. Would it be relevant, for example, to relate police and surveillance work to deportation to other colonial sites, such as the infamous French Guiana penal colony, a penal experiment once called the dry guillotine? Is there something specific to the policing of colonial subjects in the metropole as opposed to their policing in the colony? The paper hints at the fragile stability of informant citizenship status, but how are these reports involved in processes of deportation, for example, and other punitive measures in France and elsewhere? By contrast, how do we imagine the police articulation of anti-colonial groups and individuals being shaped or enabled by their moving to Paris? Third and finally, I'd like to consider the political implications of mapping the intellectual histories of anti-colonial movements from the vantage point of the metropole. I ask this having in mind the fantasies and often romantic portrayal of Paris later in the 40s and 50s as a liberatory space from which to forge Black artistic and political freedom. How is this imagination of post-war Paris and the cultural production inspired by Black writers haunted by that which Craig Lanier Allen called the specter of surveillance? How is the cultural hub of Paris dominated by the economies of suspicion and anxiety of espionage that fuel social movements and the general public? For groups imagining Black liberation, what are the stakes of thinking from within the metropole? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fernanda, for that really extraordinary set of points and taking the thinking around these issues to so many other places that connect with prior discussions. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn now to Linda Kuchler and invite you now to come in with your comments. Okay.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from in the world. Thank you to Prof. Nancy Luxon, who has given me permission to call her by her first name moving forward. So it'll be Nancy moving forward. And thank you, Fernanda, for such a wonderful engagement with this paper in the first instance. I want to thank the CHR and everyone involved, Ali, Michel, for persisting against the odds to continue to bring us together so we can collectively think about our realities both here at home and globally. Even though the shared devastation visited upon us by this pandemic has in some ways connected the world now more than it ever seemed under unrestricted circumstances. Thank you to Nancy for the paper and the opportunity to share my engagement with it with everyone here. A talk made for an interesting read, and there are some welcome provocations from it that will be ventilated in the next 10 minutes. The questions embedded in the line of inquiry of this paper broaden for me the normative lens through which we often view the complex identity formations, relations, and social positionalities of colonial subjects. In an examination of the French colonial experience, my extrapolations are that the paper makes the point that surveillance and spying are an important dimension of the French imperial nation state, and the anti-colonial movements emerging as a resistance towards it. The paper also reminds me that we cannot appreciate rather fully the nature or dynamics of French colonialism and anti-colonial French political action without examining carefully the impact of political surveillance and spying on it. And finally, at least what I have time for, it brings to life the contradiction-ridden and fluid positionality and agency of the spies in relation to their commitment to the collective political objective of emancipation and their own personal interests. As Nancy puts it, circulation wins between the personal and the collective, and between the particular and the structural. Interesting as well is the principal data instrument, police reports, police informant reports, and how they challenge our interpretation of events. Were the informants strategic double agents in the aid of the anti-colonial French movement, or was the French colonial police apparatus so entrenched that the informants truly weakened the anti-colonial movement with the information on inside political activity? Before I enter this discussion, I first ask that you indulge me in sharing with you my immediate reactions of the title of the talk and after reading a few sentences of the talk. Exposed quite intimately to the South African Liberation Archive through my own work, I found the positioning of political informants in this talk quite provocative, and that the archives show us a general disdain towards informants, evidenced by practices like necklacing in South Africa, name calling such as Imbimbi, which means spy, artistic expression of disapproval by songs like Amabhulu Amnyama, Asenzela Iwari, loosely translated as assimilating sellouts warriors, which is quite different to this remarkably generous treatment of them in this paper. I'm not provoked in ways that make Nancy's treatment of informants audacious, but rather by an invitation to look at the colonizing project and encounter as a process with far-reaching consequences on human subjectivity, the relations in the anti-colonial space, and on the imagination of a post-colonial world. At the risk of misunderstanding Nancy completely, and in turn attributing my misconceptions to her views, I attempt here to open a discussion for us about the importance of a critical appreciation of the colonial encounter and its historically evidenced vestiges on human subjectivity. In other words, how it erases, modifies, and even produces new identities. Here, though, there is a dynamic appreciation of how resistance to French colonialism resists not only the oppression, but in that process affects the colonial machinery in unexpected ways. For instance, spies like Agent Joe in the paper show the contradictions of a person enlisted as a spy for interests very particular to themselves, however realizes that the structural keeps them relegated in the French social hierarchy regardless of their efforts, which endears them more to the anti-colonial project at great personal convenience. Agent Joe's outrage at his own arrest is a very telling point that helps us understand the positionality of spies. He is outraged because he believes that his ascension to spyhood has completed his assimilation, and that it comes with a relative proximity to humanness, in this case being French. Nancy writes that Agent Joe, open quote, was arrested while surveilling others, close quote. That an irony is not only gobsmacking, but very pointed towards the ubiquity of the French colonial nation state. This reifies that policing is a tool of the state, that is the sovereign nation state, to ensure social order. Of course, order makes it easier for people to reproduce themselves socially. The contradiction, however, is that policing intervenes when people are at variance with social hierarchies and how they impact their freedom. As such, there is no one-to-one relation between policing as good and policing as bad. What there is, undeniably, is who is being policed and on what basis. Foucault's work in relation to biopolitics and the management of populations comes to mind here, in that policing becomes a governing of social, predominantly political action that contests the legitimacy of power. Echoing this on a class analytical basis, Althusser understands policing to be a repressive apparatus of the state, part and parcel of the state's artillery of dominion. Essentially, I'm persuaded, after reading the paper and engaging on my own way, by an understanding of policing as a tool of domination and the idea of safety and security as necessary ideology for its legitimation. So since policing and surveillance is hegemonic political action, it produces counter-hegemonic action, to use a phrase directly from the paper, counter-publics. With the counter-publics or counter-hegemonic action comes relative contradictions. For instance, the unreliability of informants, given the murky nature of this process, made the police vulnerable to misinformation. Moreover, the very motivations to be an informant can be compromised by the informant's commitment to the anti-colonial political objective, producing a range of contradictions that I think have been highlighted with rare grace and consideration throughout this paper. Although I do feel more could have been expanded on the material conditions that make spies possible in the first instance. The question is, with very evident dangers related to spying, what moves informants to risk so much for its benefits? Is it mere personal comfort or concrete inescapable demands for social reproduction? Regardless of the risks and whatever the motivations, spies are there, and they affect the forming and organization of the anti-colonial movement specifically, and the Black internationalists generally. The paper introduces us to the muddy water of Black internationalism in the context of surveillance and conceptual and identity incongruence in the movement. For instance, the Noir versus Negre debate, which the paper puts accurately as open quote, beyond semantics to organizing logics, close quote. Without too much time spent on this debate, it resonates with ways in which apartheid weaponized spies and spying to weaken the liberation movement in South Africa. The story of Stompie is fresh in memory, where the young United Democratic Front activist was allegedly murdered with suspicion that he could be a spy. Also, alleged attempts of the democratic constitutional state to destabilize the mass student movement in South Africa through its security agencies in the Fees Must Fall moment, and its insistence on the student movement being influenced by a third force, which are external spies motivated by regime change interests. The point here is that the democratic and apartheid regime, much like the French colonial nation state, do not only hold spies as a weapon, but the ability to generate rumors of spying to destabilize trust and effectiveness in these movements. The point is destabilization. The racialization of colonial subjects, however, is an important point raised in the paper, as it contributes to the distraction of the anti-colonial French movement. Debating social hierarchies amongst the Antilleans and the Africans in the face of mutual dehumanization by a greater enemy seems counterintuitive. However, these social categories become so entrenched that they develop a life of their own. The division amongst racialized colonial subjects resonates with the experience of formerly oppressed colonial subjects in South Africa today. A few examples are the hurtful Cape Townian minority politics in Cape Town, South Africa today, and Limqitama's crass nativism that incites violence against Somali and Pakistani spaza shop owners and operators, the Economic Freedom Front's sustained attack on Indians in South Africa, all are reflective of the warning sounded by a quote in the paper from Dionson, that the divisions among the oppressed are less of their own objective making, but made possible by the imperial and colonial project through direct and indirect rule. And as we see in the talk today, surveillance and police. Ultimately, the instrumentality of spying and surveillance in the French colonial experience has implications on anti-colonial French and Black internationalist organizing. Throughout the paper, there is a decidedly Foucaultian appreciation of order versus disorder, the stabilization, uncertainty, vacillations between the dominant and the other. This makes for a dynamic and careful appreciation of a truly very intricate set of social processes. If not the valuable appreciation of policing as domination, surveillance as an act against the response to domination, and constantly shifting political logics, this paper is important for the stretching of ideas of the and a people beyond the normative treatment of them as definite and unproblematic social categories. And of course, I want to end with a couple of questions to spark debate, not only with Nancy, but with everyone who's joined us today. Firstly, given the universality of spying and invasive surveillance prevalent today in the forms of digital information and consumer behavior, how do we understand its shifting nature in the post-colonial context? I repeat, given the universality of spying and invasive surveillance prevalent today in the forms of digital information and consumer behavior, how do we understand its shifting nature in the post-colonial context? And finally, with the interesting character of Agent Joe, and beyond the significance of surveilling and spying and its historical universality as an instrument for policing, what about it do you particularly want us to take from it? I repeat again, finally, with the interesting character of Agent Joe and beyond the significance of surveillance and spying as historically universal as an instrument for policing, what about it do you particularly want us to take from it? Thank you very much for the paper and for everyone for joining us. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Linda Kutler. That's a marvelous, spirited set of responses to the paper by Nancy. And Nancy, what I'm going to suggest is that we give you a little bit of space to address the questions by Fernanda and Linda Kutler, even if it's in a preliminary way, because I think when we move to questions from other participants in the webinar today, I think we will find that these are going to be developed further. So don't feel that you have to answer everything immediately, but I think we need to have a response from you in a preliminary way. So let me hand back to you, Nancy. Thank you.
So first, just wow, those are fantastic comments and engagements and provocations. And thank you to Linda, to Fernanda, for those offerings as a way of getting our conversation started. There is a lot to respond to here. So let me identify 3 points that I want to come back to that I think might also contribute to a broader conversation amongst the webinar participants. The first, concerns the attention, that Fernanda gave, to thinking about the exposition as a heterotopia, as a place that is at once an emplacement, but then you also use this nice phrase, you described it as a site of decaying fantasies. And so I think part of what is at stake in thinking about these surveillance reports and the way that they're caught between the kind of spectacle of the exposition, but also the mundanity of meeting after meeting after meeting, in cramped assembly halls, in these spaces where people are gathering after work well into the night. I think that there is a real, sort of question about how to balance the materiality, of these spaces, heterotopic or not, alongside the kind of symbolic engagements and representations that are also in play, both in the exposition, but then also, in these, more everyday meeting spaces. And that part of what is happening with the exposition, with the surveillance work, is an effort, not just to navigate between two well-defined political ideologies, or three well-defined political ideologies of republicanism, imperialism, and anti-colonialism, but then also to really think about this interplay between the material and the symbolic. And for those who were active in the anti-colonial movements, I think that part of what is constantly threading through the reports of these meetings is an effort to think about, to work through both deliberately and inadvertently a new set of symbolic representations that might orient some other kind of politics. And I think that it's very difficult to ever quite get a handle on that interplay between the material and the symbolic in politics. And that one of the stakes, then in looking at these reports and looking at this particular time period, is trying to think about what it means not to persuade or to contest or to challenge, which are oftentimes the way we normally think about political transformation, but to think about, those, material claims and symbolic representations that are really at the heart of backing away from one set of political investments or one vision of political order, and then starting to scaffold up another. And so there's, I think a kind of ambiguity, of ambivalence, of oscillation, that is really, quite visible in the colonial exposition itself, that we can then take back to, these other seemingly mundane activities, with an eye towards, well, where are some of those oscillations? Where are some of those uncertainties, getting worked out, in more everyday conversations? The second point, and this speaks, both to some of the points raised by Fernanda, but also raised, by Linda Kula, is thinking about, what's the relationship, between these reports and then questions of criminality. And I think that this, in some ways, invites us to start thinking about and identifying other speech contexts, in which the category of criminality and then the technologies of surveillance are doing some amount of regulating work to determine, who it is that gets seen and heard and on what terms, and how are our responses, to, those people, being organized in relationship to a body of evidence. that's very abstract. So let me give, a more concrete, example. One of the sites where we also see this same language being used is precisely in, psychiatric hospitals, in Northern Africa, where, the Algiers school was very much invested in a notion of what it called North African criminality. And before Fanon even went to North Africa, one of his very first writings, that was published in a psychiatric journal, took on what was then being called the North African syndrome, And so, and in reading that particular article, what's interesting is that he's not simply saying that this, is, a diagnostic category that is racist, that is inflected by colonialism, and that is, empirically invalid, although he makes those points, along the course of the article. He also is very concerned to show and to stage what happens when, he finds himself working with North Africans in Paris who are coming into psychiatric clinics and trying to present a series of symptoms that then get misheard, misidentified, and misdiagnosed onto a different set of colonial categories. And so for Fanon, the question, as Linda Kulo was saying, it's not just the normative one of is this right or is this wrong, but how can we start to think about the perceptions of colonial subjects, the social intermediaries that are trying to organize those perceptions, and then the bodies of evidence, so to speak, either from police reports or, from medical proceedings, that are used, to ground and then to reproduce, these perceptions, and responses. And so I think it's interesting, then to juxtapose the psychiatric speech context with these police reports, because you find a similar set of dynamics as to who is going to control this space, and again, in reference to what body of knowledge. And then the third point that I wanted to come back to, which in some ways emerges from what I just said, is Linda Kulo's point as to, well, what do you do with these reports and how should we dispose ourselves to or respond to the informants? I think that you're right that the two dominant tendencies are tendencies either, to be dismissive and condemnatory of informants for being those who are traitors, of different kinds, or to romanticize them. I mean, I think that there are many Western historians who read these reports and find in them, something, that is unexpected, and so lends itself, to, a story of contestation, or of counter movements, that they are very invested in discovering or in wanting to be present. And so I think there's this real instability to the reports and to the figures of the informants, that needs to be given, its due. Interestingly enough, in some of the reports from the LDRN, you have some of the militants, especially Kouate, who was quite proud of the fact that, the LDRN owned police officers. They had counteragents. They were able to flip some people and to acquire the money, in order to get these informants to essentially plant false reports. And so there's this, interesting question of, well, what are we trying to do when we're trying to stabilize these reports or these figures? What is it that is motivating us to stabilize these figures and their reports, either as political or race traitors or as political romantics of a different kind? And what happens when we allow them to remain ambivalent, and, as Linda Kulo was suggesting, to allow them to oscillate across different registers, and to do a different work, in a different space. As I start to move this project forward, I very much am curious, to think about what policing and surveillance look like, in North Africa itself, and to think a little bit more about the connections to colonial administration, and different forms of colonial management. And so I'm hoping when all of the travel bans that are in place are finally lifted, I'll be able to do some more of that archival research that at the moment is a twinkle in my eye, so to speak. So anyways, I will stop there because I can see that there are a number of questions that are starting to amass in the queue.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Right, I think we need to move to some of the questions that are coming in, and I urge participants, please do put in your questions in the Q&A, and we will try to get to everybody. So Nancy, you can probably read. Would that be helpful? We can think about it as we hear. So this is from Yassine Samuels. In terms of the idea of Black internationalism, what role did race and religion play in further enforcing France's colonial narrative, as well as the anti-colonial movements in its North African colonies and their assimilation to this idea? Another question, what racial categorization was given to individuals from North African colonies residing in 20th century France? Thank you. Would you like to take that, Nancy?
Thank you for pointing out that I had not unmuted myself. In thinking about the roles for race and religion in enforcing France's colonial narrative, as well as anti-colonial movements, I mean, there has been a lot that has been written about 19th century France's civilizing mission and how it very much understood itself as bringing a certain set of cultural and educational institutions, to the geographic regions, where it held colonies. There's comparatively less attention, that is, given to the emergence of debates around the abolition of slavery and thinking about the place for race and for religion in 18th century French republicanism. And thinking about the kinds of contradictions, that were really visible at a much earlier point in time. One of the reasons for calling attention to that earlier set of 18th century debates, is in part, to think about, how recent the language of inclusion as an anchoring concept for civic republicanism, has become. That in looking at debates that originated in the 1790s, for example, prior to and alongside of the Haitian Revolution, there's an emergent sense amongst historians, that when, the French were debating, the extension of the rights of man and of citizenship, to different French colonies, that what counted as equality was very much limited to political terms, that thinking about equality or freedom on social terms, of contact and proximity, was not something, that many French revolutionaries were willing to consider. And certainly thinking about equality or freedom in terms of economic equality or freedom from exploitation was, not really part of the debate at all. And so I think, part of what it would mean then, to start thinking in the 20th century, about, what one might call a Black internationalism, is to think about how some of the key anchoring concepts around racial affiliation, religious affiliation, or something like equality and freedom need to be disaggregated and understood in terms of their variability across, French's colonies. The Antilles were always considered to be an exception and quite different, from what was the way that race played a part in thinking about any kind of Black internationalism that stretched more broadly across Africa, or even that was trying to make connections to anti-colonial movements, in Indochina. And so there, is, a real experimentation, I think, around, these different categories, around different ways of trying to re-inhabit them, around the kinds of affiliations that they might pull into focus. I'm seeing more questions coming in as well.
Thanks very much, Nancy. Nancy, we actually have a question from one of our fellows who's based in Maputo, where the line is a little bit difficult, and he's put it in the chat function. So if Shai and Jane don't mind waiting for us to respond to your questions, I just want to get Arnaldo's question in before there's a possible interruption in internet. So Arnaldo Kalish's question to you, Nancy, is how to frame the populist politics with self-determination in context of the post-colonial political participation of the people in Southern Africa, where the subjects about human rights are called into question. How to analyze in methodological terms the political narratives addressed to the people according to the legacy of the colonial political narratives in the post-colonial period. And Arnaldo is saying that these two questions are related to your discussion, Nancy, raised in your paper on pages 5 to 7. And Arnaldo's also saying how helpful your paper is thinking about his PhD project, which is about Samora Michel's political rhetoric, origins, structure, social life, and its legacies against racism, apartheid, and enemies of the people. So do you want to respond immediately, Nancy? Is that okay? And then I'll come back into the Q&A list. And just to say to all participants, kindly use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side. Let me hand back to you, Nancy. Thank you.
So these are terrific questions. Thank you very much for them. In thinking about how to analyze political narratives addressed to the people, I think in part, and this is something that already has come up in the discussant comments, but in part, what these reports, these newspapers, these literary salons, indicate, is how much some notion of the people has been the result of a kind of framework imported from the West in thinking about an emergent civil society or public sphere alongside a quest for national liberation and the eventual achievement of a telos in the nation state. And so, methodologically speaking, I think, the kind of drive, of my paper is to query, whether, how obvious or self-evident or necessary these narratives of we the people, need to be, to what extent are they really a response to narrative capture, let's say, by the terms of dominant discourse, and are part really then of an effort to make legible and to make visible a kind of politics, that is more multivalent, and that oftentimes is very much a challenge to the organizing terms of political discourse. For me, in looking at these reports, but then also reading more about the workers' associations, reading the newspapers that they're producing and so on, is that the political terms are really all over the place. There is a lot of experimentation, with different ways, of thinking about what might broadly be termed a kind of anti-colonial politics. And so there's a real effort to think about, well, what might something else, look like? And so the terms aren't automatically those of, a singular univocal we the people or the nation, that's coming into our own. And I think that it's very easy, to look over that, in part because, there you know, as you know, David Scott has argued, there's very much a romantic narrative, you know, that has become attached to Enlightenment, humanism, and politics, where we want to really think about like this, you know, romantic, you know, politics of national, you know, upsurge and liberation, you know, that risks really limiting, you know, the kinds of visions of, you know, political possibility that are available or that are on order. You know, and so, you know, for me, in going back to the 20s and 30s, rather than starting with Présence Africaine or looking at some of those figures who are most usually associated with narratives of the people or of, you know, national, you know, self-determination, it's a way to uncover some of that messiness and then just start asking the harder political questions about how do these other possibilities get shut down. I mean, it's not simply a question of adherence, you know, it's also a question of what allows terms to circulate, what allows for them, you know, to have uptake, and, you know, what are the efforts, you know, on the part of public authorities to prevent certain kinds of terms from entering into public discourse. You know, on the part of French public authorities then, you know, they were very uninterested, you know, in hearing, so to speak, or in receiving, you know, that these anti-colonial movements were very much trying to challenge an organizing paradigm of international politics that was still, you know, the remnants of imperial order. You know, they wanted to see, you know, these, you know, different groups on other terms, and predominantly responded to them as being anti-French, you know, and saw any efforts, you know, to engage in a kind of complexity of argumentation around the terrain of debate, you know, to be a sign of being two-faced. I mean, the comments about the newspaper, the Dépêche Africaine, I thought were fascinating, you know, for the accusation that there was something sly or disingenuous, you know, about representing a plurality of political views. The second reason why this is methodologically important is then you start to recover a different set of political actors. And in the paper, you know, I gestured towards, but didn't develop fully, the place for women and considerations, you know, of gender, you know, in, you know, these narratives and in these, you know, anti-colonial associations. This is something that I'm hoping to, you know, again, do more work on when I'm able to get back into the archives. But what's fascinating is that many of the police reports indicated who was present. And the categories were kind of all over the place. Sometimes they were racialized, sometimes they were in terms of citizenship or country of origin. But they also indicated that there were a number of women who were present, probably primarily white women who were married to anti-colonial militants. And so it's interesting to think about the presence, you know, that they have within these movements, and to query, well, what kind of role can they play, or are they restricted from playing? What is, you know, again, the kind of slippery place for gender and the formulation of something like peoplehood that is, you know, in play here? How can we start to understand some of those terms? Why is it that women are this kind of constant present absence? They're noted as being present, even as, you know, concerns about gender very rarely make it onto the pages of these newspapers or into the political programs, you know, of some of these different groups. My third and final point, you know, about the kind of methodology, you know, that is in play here, is that by looking at these kinds of interstitial spaces, and by thinking about how they predate so many of the usual political narratives, you know, around national self-determination or around a certain set of political actors, we can then start to tell, you know, a different kind of story, which is the story of emergence. You know, it might be the story of successful emergence, it might be the story of failure, but it becomes a way, you know, to try and unsettle and to start re-inhabiting, you know, some of the usual conceptual terms and paradigms, you know, that consistently organize specifically anti-racist, and anti-colonial politics. And considering that we continue to be really wrestling with and grappling with these, issues in our contemporary moment, I think that there is a lot of analytic and political value in recovering the indeterminacy, of these in-between spaces.
Nancy, thank you. Those absolutely brilliant methodological points that you're laying out there in response to Arnaldo's question. And thank you very much, Arnaldo, for that. Let's move on to our next in the Q&A session. And there's a really wonderful question here from Shai Gortler, which in fact reminds me of some of the preface to the Arlette, Farge and Michel Foucault Disorderly Families. So let me just read this for us. Traditionally, political theory mostly engages texts written by theorists or philosophers. What for this project are the stakes of conducting it within the archive? What differentiates this project from a historical one on the one hand and from a version of political theory mostly interested in ideas on the other? Such a wonderful question. Let me get back over to you, Nancy.
That is a really fabulous question. And again, it comes back to some of the points raised by the discussants. I mean, I think part of the motivation for this question is just the simpler question of what is the archive for this project? And what would it mean, what does it mean to write from a series of texts that are often not elevated to so-called canonical status? But even more than that, I think there's a question of how to stage drawing upon these archival resources that must necessarily move between different sites. And so for me, especially as I was listening alongside the discussant comments, I've been thinking about how to de-emphasize what is currently a very Eurocentric perspective. Some of that is driven by the fact that the French are tremendous bureaucrats and administrators, and they keep every single piece of paper that ever crosses through the hands of any kind of public administration. So for the Disorderly Families Project, one of the interesting anecdotes that is connected to it, it comprises different letters of arrest, that date to the mid-18th century, that were letters written by husbands, wives, children, neighbors, demanding the arrest of somebody who was disorderly in some way or another. What's fascinating is not just that tens of thousands of these letters remained, but that as the Bastille was stormed, and as revolutionaries were just tearing all of the dossiers out and throwing them into the streets, at a certain point they realized that they were throwing away the records of everything that the French sovereign had done. And so they issued an appeal that if you were to find, pieces, of rag stock or linen or something that looked like it might be a record in the street, please kindly bring it back, to the Bastille so that it could be properly sorted, and put back into the collection. And having worked with those documents, a number of them actually were returned from the streets and are now covered in centuries-old dirt and mud and all of the rest of it. In thinking about these archives, part of what really interested and surprised me is that in addition to the typed copies that were made of all of the agents' report, where they were typed up on a manual typewriter with multiple carbon copies that were then distributed across police precincts, but then also to colonial administrators, in French colonies, they also preserved all of the handwritten records, all of the actual reports written by the different agents. I think one of the reasons why Agent Jouet gets picked up so often is his reports were so lengthy and so detailed. every single day, 5, 7, 10 pages of commentary on what's going on around him and what's happening in these meetings. And he was just so, he was a chatterbox. He was constantly bringing in all kinds of colorful detail, which, you know, Linda Kula, I'm looking at you through the camera, you know, wondering, you know, what it is that he's reporting that is true, what is exaggeration, you know, what is it that he is using to try as a way of trying to destabilize his readers. It's really difficult to say. What these archives do show, though, coming back to Shai's question, you know, is a little bit about the workings of power. You know, not everything that he wrote down made it into the final reports. And what was interesting is after, you know, he was harassed by the police for the first time, his, you know, reportings of harassment were consistently excised from the reports that were typed up and distributed across the police precincts. And so there was a lot that was apparently considered to be extraneous and was not, you know, pulled into the final reports. And so that's interesting. I mean, that tells us a little bit something unexpected as to not just what is the content, the substantive content or ideology of a written text or of a person or of an agency, but what is being deliberately omitted, what is being deliberately, you know, left out. I think that looking at this kind of archive then demands that we think about it in relation to other possible archives. I'd be curious in some ways for this project to think about a juxtaposition of those papers collected by police authorities in Paris versus those collected in Marseille versus those collected in Africa itself, in part because the jurisdiction of the different agencies involved is quite different. The police are involved, the secret police, the Ministry of the Colonies, and the ministries, you know, of immigration, all are fighting for jurisdiction in hiring informants and collecting information on groups, and they don't always share their information very effectively. But across those 3 geographic sites, you also see different perspectives onto what I was just describing as these workings of power. In Marseille, for example, where Lamine Senghor ends up organizing on behalf of first the LDRN and then the UTN, he's primarily organizing dock workers, you know, and those, you know, who are working on ships that are moving back and forth across the Mediterranean. And so he's working, you know, with people who mostly do not have French citizenship and are not in one of those ambivalent categories where they might acquire it, meaning they're not from the Antilles, they're not from the 4 communes in Senegal. As a result, their 2 primary concerns are unemployment, because, you know, they're worried about getting stranded someplace, you know, where they don't have the possibility of finding another job or finding legal work. They're also worried about deportation. It becomes very difficult for them to start thinking about family life, for example, or to think about any kinds of affiliations, let alone political solidarities, precisely because, you know, of the instability and liminality, really, of their position, you know, in Marseille, but constantly at risk of being deported elsewhere. In the colonies, you know, there, you know, the context is different in many ways because, you know, the kinds of rewards, I suppose, to use that term very gingerly, that could be given to informants are different. It's less a question of citizenship, you know, and more a question of status, you know, and you know, how it is that you could move through a colonial hierarchy. And so what it means to participate in policing, you know, or informing on others, I think takes on a very different valence. You know, someone like Agent Joé, I think, can potentially, you know, manage an existence where you're sometimes part of the Republic and sometimes working against the empire. I think that kind of ambivalent position is not really something that is available, you know, if you are working for the colonial administration in, you know, North Africa itself. I think it would be a much more dangerous, you know, situation to be in, you know, but also the psychology that's associated with it, I think would need to be different.
Great, thank you very much. Nancy, we're moving on now to a question from our colleague at the CHR, Jane Taylor, who asks you whether you have any thoughts about how this question of assimilation engages with questions of translation and language theory.
The disadvantage of this webinar setting is, this is where I would love to ask a follow-up and to better understand, where Jane is coming from. I think, oftentimes with questions of translation, or language theory, there is an effort to really think about questions, of excess, and to think about, different kinds of representations that exceed the bounds of what can be captured, in language, and what can be communicated. I think, part of what these surveillance reports help us to really think about is what it means, to bring into contact not just two different perspectives onto the same thing, where there is an object of debate, say questions of citizenship or a particular kind of public policy that people might have different approaches or attitudes towards. That part of what we see with these surveillance reports, is language as a tool of world disclosure that is opening up not different views onto the same stable object, interwar Paris, but that is opening up different views onto a world that is organized on different terms in reference to different actors, and that has simply a different political horizon attached to it. I have in mind here the first chapter to Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask, where he thinks about the role of language and politics and psychopathology, and is really thinking about language in a kind of phenomenological sense, as something that is an instrument or constitutive of a kind of world disclosure. And so the goal or the point isn't necessarily to make coincident or congruent, those languages or those worlds, but to really think about everything, that is, kind of trailed with those moments of disclosure. And then also to recognize that there's always going to be something that is either in your blind spot, to stay within the register, of phenomenology, or to switch registers to psychoanalysis, something that is really in excess, of what is capable of being represented, of having even a connotative influence, on what it is that you're doing and seeing, and how you understand those actions. And so I think part of the reason why I'm moving between these different speech contexts is, to try and, find a way to talk through that experience of excess, not with the goal of stabilizing it or capturing it or making it somehow legible, and cognizable, but by understanding how and in what ways, does it, come into play both in daily life, or in political life. So for Fanon and the work that I'm doing on the psychiatric hospital, there you have again a site, where there is this constant question, of language, of assimilation, of integration. What does it mean to engage in any kind of healing activity, in treating people who are traumatized, by the excesses of colonialism, but while resisting the force of assimilation, that is resisting the tendency of psychiatry or psychoanalysis to integrate people back into some kind of, dominant, and in this case, colonial order, such that they feel less incongruent, with their surroundings. And so these different speech contexts help us, to think about those moments of excess of disclosure, but then also to start thinking more concretely, more politically about how to take those excesses of symbolic representation and to start to build something, underneath them.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Let's keep rolling. Your capacity to answer is really phenomenal. Thank you. We have a question from our colleague in the Department of Anthropology at UWC, Kelly Gillespie, who asks whether you've looked at the 1931 exhibition in the context of the great exhibitions of the 19th century. Might the ways in which those earlier exhibitions were exhibited and controlled say something more historically specific about the post-war moment and its production of the anti-colonial / Black internationalist conversation? Over to you, Nancy.
That is absolutely something that is on my mind. I've done some readings around the great exhibitions of the 19th century in Britain, and especially the Crystal Palace, thinking about some of the cartoons that were produced alongside the Crystal Palace, and the ways that those cartoons started out by mocking and making fun of the class divide, between those who were British aristocrats, and those, who were British workers coming in for what were called, I think, tuppence days, where you could pay a 2-penny entrance price, and participate in the exhibition, for less than the usual entry fee. And then one of those, cartoons, the caption underneath it, says, fancy meeting you here. And you have a set of upper class, Brits, meeting up with a set of working class people. And the cartoon is in some ways funny because there is no surprise about meeting you here. The whole point of the 2-penny entrance, was to allow for, working class people to attend. They were bussed in, there was transportation that was arranged, et cetera, et cetera. And so there shouldn't really be the shock of class confrontation or the scandal of meeting someone from a different socioeconomic position. In any case, as the Crystal Palace unfolded, there was increasingly the sense that, okay, these cartoons weren't really finding their audience in quite the right way. And so Punch started to produce a series of cartoons making fun of British colonial subjects, Native Americans, in North America, and occasionally women. And so, that kind of class antagonism was interestingly gendered and racialized and redirected to other vulnerable populations. And so some of what I've read then, about these, British exhibitions, is that there was, an interesting way in which working class Brits were invited to participate in a kind of national consciousness that was also imperial, as a way of investing them in holding on to empire at a time when empire was becoming increasingly expensive, contested, hard to maintain, and so on. I need to do a little bit more, both to think about the connections between British anti-colonialism and French anti-colonialism, and that's someplace that I'm headed next. And then also to get a little bit more information on the different, demographics, of who attended which, and what was really the performance of coloniality in each site. And so that's something that I don't yet have an answer to, but I am looking forward to learning more and would love to be in touch with you, since it sounds like some of your own research tends in that direction.
That's great. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Kelly, for that question. And we have a set of comments here from Alexandra Dodd, who's joining us as a fellow from University of Fort Hare. Thanks very much for this. So let me just read it. She just wants to recommend, in the context of discussions around policing in the metropole / colony, that Hlonipha Mokwena's current research into the figure of the Zulu policeman, which is explored across visual historical archive, looking at their uniforms as evidencing their circulation, indeed from one career to another. And she's drawing our attention to the 19th century figure in South African history of the, quote, Fingo African levy, end of quote, an irregular, underpaid soldier caught up in the Eastern Cape, frontier wars foreshadowing the emergence of the Zulu policeman. So that a nice example of perhaps oscillation, movement, circulation. I don't know if you want to comment on that quickly, Nancy.
Just very briefly, first, thank you for the suggestion. That's something that I'll certainly follow up with. In some of the research that I've done, I had found something similar, usually connected, to World War I. And there it's interesting. I mean, the French police were very preoccupied in knowing, what were the views about World War I, or the sort of resulting sympathies held by anti-colonial militants. And so you have these exercise books that are divided into a grid where you have name, occupation, address, views about World War I, and then then a kind of a column for other. And so it was interesting that World War I was something that was and attitudes towards World War I was something that seemed so important from the perspective of the French police. From the perspective, of some of these, militants and others, the war, brought with it, different kinds of markers. Obviously, the potential marker of citizenship, since many of those who fought in World War I were able eventually to be naturalized according to a 1922 decree. But then also in some of the visuals that I found around Paris at the time, and I think about the exposition, but I would need to double check, are figures, of African soldiers, in military dress, who were present, as a way of, performing again, this kind of tension between French republicanism and imperialism at the exposition. And so, the photographs that are emergent from the exposition are interesting from the way that the camera differently tries to position, for example, Senegalese women, to those who are dancers, to those, who are being presented as, French soldiers, and the visuality of those three images is quite different. The camera angles are different. The way that the gaze is structured, is quite different. And so that's something that you're now encouraging me to think more about as a way of capturing some of the circulation. Interestingly, also, the French, often would move from occupying positions in administration in the metropole to then occupying positions in colonial administration, in Africa. Sometimes, people would then move on to French Indochina. And so it seems, that there's also a kind of circulation of policing figures, that I'd like to do a little bit more to track and to better understand.
Okay, Nancy, that's fantastic. So many rich veins to explore here. It's quite extraordinary. Thank you so much for entertaining all our questions. I'm now moving on to the next one, which is coming from Okuchukwu Nwafor, who was a fellow with us at the CHR and is now joining us from Michigan, which is great. So he says, without taking you away from your main subject, how do you explain anti-colonial resistance and post-colonial resistance happening among French colonies today as they attempt to resist France's economic policies? What is the role of post-colonial subjects, complicities of political subjects, and what does that tell us about the histories of anti-colonial movements? So what does anti-colonial policing tell us about post-colonial policing? Thanks, Nancy.
That is a very searching question, and it's going to be one that I'm afraid I won't be able to answer satisfactorily, in part just because it's complicated. And I would say complicated, for two reasons. The first has a little bit to do, again, with methodology and archives. The French archives, around, policing as it affected both Algeria and then pro-Algeria protests, in France in the 1960s were briefly unsealed. There was a flurry of some publications actually about the role of the French police in moving, back and forth across those boundaries. And then my understanding is that those archives, have, under the guise of various administrative reasonings, been resealed. And so I call attention to that, methodological quandary, because I think that there is a really fascinating, question, about the ways in which surveillance technologies move back and forth between what is standardly understood as policing and what is often distinguished as, a kind of, international surveillance, let's say. And I think that that distinction, and Linda Coulé's, comments, hinted at this, that distinction is becoming increasingly blurred, in part with the use of digital surveillance, and in part because, of the very deliberate imbrication of both, domestic and global ways, of thinking about safety and security. I think one of the reasons why, France then is a very interesting place to raise this question is precisely because as a country, it has been so consistently invested in making use of police technologies, but also as a way to sort out changes, between different political modalities or different logics of governance. And so this is Foucault's basic point that, as we move from a politics of sovereignty to thinking about a politics of discipline, to thinking about a politics of governmentality, or even, a kind of post-colonial governmentality, jurisdictions, institutional prerogatives are constantly shifting, and end up inadvertently fueling these, different visions of political order in ways that are oftentimes inadvertent and unintended. And so I think France would be a terrific site to really kind of puzzle through, some of those questions. One of the questions, that, you're also raising is what's the role for France's economic policies, in all of that, in all of this. And I think that's something that has been tremendously underattended. There's been some recent work published, by historian Carolyn Fick, by a political theorist, Adam Getachew, trying to think about what it means to seek an end to political domination, even as many of France's colonies, notably Haiti, remained very much caught up in a colonial economy of export and extraction. And that it is possible to imagine a circumstance in which you might bring an end to some amount of, or you might mitigate the experience of a specifically political form of domination or those hierarchies, but that it becomes then nearly impossible to try and thread those changes through to an economic register. And so I take that that's where the motivation of this question is really pushing, and I think that it's something that is demanding of more attention. I think too often we focus on policing or on political relations of domination, precisely because they seem potentially more capable of diagnosis and contestation. Whereas relations of economic dependency are much more difficult to organize around, much more complicated, to analyze, their inner workings. And so, kind of bringing the analysis forward in that way, is simply more complicated. So I look forward to hearing more from you about how some of your own work might be tending in those ways, since that seems, again, where this question might be coming from.
Thanks so much, Nancy. It is very difficult when we can't have a dialogue over the table together or even after the lecture. So just to say thank you for that question, okay, and maybe we can take this up in certain ways, as Nancy suggests. So Nancy, I'm moving to what appears to be your last question, which is coming from Jonathan Bildo. And it is to say that in reading Hannah Arendt's book, The Origin of Totalitarianism, the question is, what was the idea of assimilation known to the Black informants, which they sought to take advantage of? And did the French police deliberately lure them with the idea of assimilation? Thanks.
So, yes, the French police did deliberately lure the agents, perhaps not so much with the notion of assimilation, but at least with, the notion of political standing and status. And so there were a different range, of things that were promised to informants in exchange for their services. Sometimes it was help in repatriating family members to metropolitan France. Again, depending on where the informants originated, citizenship wasn't something that they could always lay claim to. And so that made it very difficult for them to bring wives, children, family members, from Indochina, or what was then Indochina, from, North Africa, from other sites. Sometimes it was simply, economic payment. Most informants received some sum of money, in compensation, for the work they were doing. Sometimes it was outright, help with naturalization, and citizenship status. And so there was this real, sense, I think, that both these promises were instrumentally advantageous for the informants. But from the perspective of the French, it also helps them to regulate the contradiction, of having, certain colonial subjects present on French soil, doing a certain kind of work, in the service, of some notion of public safety and order. As to whether the assimilants or whether the informants, were attracted to this notion of assimilation, I think that's a harder question, to answer. I think, that, certainly, given Agent Joyet's protestations over police harassment, it was clear that he had hoped that, his informant status would at least bring an end, to that dimension of his daily life. I think that is fair to say. As to whether, that then meant that, on, again, a kind of Fanonian, set of terms, he understood himself to be a member of a kind of colonial elite, then I think is much more complicated, to say. I think that these informants, as I argue in the paper, occupy the status of mediator, sure, but whether or not they find appealing or are invested in the kinds of goods of an assimilationist ideal, I think is harder to establish with any degree of certainty. If again, their families had to have known that they were involved in this work, given that so many of them were often infiltrating, the same organizations, there has to be a mixture, of both suspicion, but I also wonder of a kind of, shared secrecy, around this work. On the one hand, all of the different informants would report back to a common set of police officers. So there's always some danger that if your report is out of line with what others are producing, that could trip you up. And the police sought to use this as a way to better kind of regulate and monitor their own use and dependency on informants. At the same time, there also seems to be a measure of canniness and again, a kind of, shared secrecy around, this work that oftentimes comes out. In one of the files that I haven't had a chance to look through myself, but that I've read about in historians' accounts, there was a description of a Vietnamese informant, who, was convinced he had some very important information, wanted to share it, figured out, who, within the police administration, to go talk to and to share this information with, gained a personal audience, with this person, and then was also trying to ask some questions and to feel out, well, why are you interested in this group of restaurant workers? And what do you know about this other group and this and that? Long story short, the informant in question turned out to be Ho Chi Minh, who was able to successfully play on, the instabilities of the context to actually try and use a very ephemeral informant status to get information from the police themselves. And so I think that there's an interesting set, of tactics and counter tactics, that is difficult to entirely substantiate or to pin down, but at the very least, should complicate the ways that we normally want to understand, police officers and police subjects as two distinct and relatively separate entities. And I think I'll end there.
Okay. Yeah. Just the riches of these archives and the way that you refuse to have this reduced to some kind of positivism, and instead work out the categories and also remind us about what we do, or how to question ourselves when we try to stabilize things, I think is really such a scintillating and extraordinary example of scholarship, Nancy. I really, that was awesome. And I just want to thank you again for marvelous opportunity here that we've had with you this afternoon. I know we are running out of time. I just wanted to check in with our discussants. Unfortunately, Linda Kuhle, he indicated that his load shedding had been unreliable. He had hoped would come back on, but his battery went flat, so he's not able to be with us right now, which is very unfortunate. But I just want to check in with Fernanda in case, Fernanda, you would like to add any final comment or question, given that, we have to make do with what we can with our dialogic spaces. So would you like to add anything, Fernanda, before we go?
Not at the moment. Patricia, thank you so much for checking, and thank you, Nancy, for this wonderful discussion. This was amazing. Really enjoyed it.
Well, and I just want to thank all of you all who are gathered virtually in different ways, for asking just such thoughtful and penetrating questions, and for really keeping me on my toes for the last hour and a half or so. I am coming away from this with all kinds of, different thoughts about how to develop this project, and to take it forward. And so I'm very interested in continuing these conversations. And so if anyone has a point that they would like to follow up on or wants to be in further contact, please absolutely do not hesitate to send me an email. I would love to hear from you, and we can find other ways of continuing the conversation.
Right. Okay, with that, Nancy, thank you. And you may go away and have a well-deserved cup of coffee or whatever. So nice to have you with us, really wonderful. And I'm going to close by just reminding us, I know it's been announced, but I want to reiterate and encourage everybody to join us again for our third session of the Winter School for 2020, where our presenter will be Heidi Grunebaum from the CHR, and her presentation has the title Leaving Zion. The paper will be circulated in advance from the 7th of September so that we can read it before the actual date of our meeting. The webinar will be held on the 14th of September at 3 p.m. So please do let us reconvene and continue these wonderful conversations together. And with that, I say goodbye and take care.
Wow.
That was just incredible.
Bravo, everybody. Bravo.
Well done, Nancy and Patricia and Amanda. It was amazing. I think we're still on Facebook. We should cut.
I see live happening there. So
yeah, for now, end watch party.